Hello, I am Henry Crawford, and welcome to Poets versus the Pandemic, a series devoted to poets whose books have come out during this time of coronavirus and sheltering in place. Tonight, we're featuring David Keplinger, whose selected works, The Long Answer, was just published by Stephen F. Austin University Press. Before we begin, I would like to thank the WordWorks and Cafe Muse for helping sponsor this event, and I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. So let's get a few housekeeping things out of the way. First, and most importantly, if you want to purchase David's book, The Long Answer, please click on the tab, click on the button that's right at the bottom of your screen. It's all you need to do. Click on that and you'll be taken right over to the site where you can buy the book. If you would like to see David's bio, just click on the tab in the upper left part of your screen that says David Keplinger. Click on that and you'll be able to see a rough scale, version of his bio. And of course, if you we would love to have you follow all of our WordWorks readings, Cafe Muse, Poets versus the Pandemic. Just click on the Follow tab in the upper right corner of the screen. Now, if you want to ask a question of our poet, you can just click on the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen and read other people's questions, and you can vote on the ones that you want to hear most. And we'll try to take the top voted questions at the end of the reading if we have some. Also, remember, you are not on camera, so you don't have to worry about mics and cameras and how you're dressed or what room you're in or if you've combed your hair. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the poetry. And if you want to comment, use the chat feature. It's very robust and very lively, so please make use of that. A couple more things. Please join us on May 4, 2020, when Cafe Muse will feature poets Lisa Lewis and Brad Richard. And please come back for our next Poets versus the Pandemic on Wednesday, May 13, 2020. There we'll be featuring poet Nadia Colburn reading from her new book, The High Shelf. Finally, if you want to come back to this reading, just click on the same link that got you here. And the reading will be there because it is archived on this site. So with all that out of the way, let me start by saying how happy and honored I am to introduce my good friend, the remarkable poet, David Keplinger. I usually introduce poets with a recitation of their accomplishments and some thoughts about their poetry, but this is not a usual time. So if you want to see some accomplishments, and David doesn't need any of that kind of introduction. If you want to see some of that, you can just click on the tab that I mentioned before. But what I would like to do, though, is spend just a few minutes talking about his work as a teacher and a mentor. In a workshop, David Keplinger can take a poem that you've scrawled out, and in a couple of minutes, he can move it around and rewrite it, and then he could hand it to you as if it was going to go into the New Yorker tomorrow. But then what he'll really do is give it back to you so that you can rework the poem in that unique way that you, the poet, was actually called to write it. He spends countless hours helping poets craft their books, and as a result gets to write a lot of blurbs. My sense of knowing David Keplinger is that he will not stop until a student's poetic voice is fully realized. So without saying any more, I'm just going to turn this crowdcast over to David and his poems. He's going to be using a screen share so that you can help, so that you can see them. And with all of that, I think I'm going to take myself off the screen here and turn it over to David Keplinger.
Henry, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me. Getting an echo, so I don't know if I'm getting...
No, you're good.
The same. Okay, it's coming back at me. All right, well, I'll try to do it this way. This poem is called Hymn. We are somewhere in a story, a certain hymn begins. It's the night the lights have failed. My mother reclines on the couch, the candles all around her. My father hunches over the fuse box. We're somewhere in a story, the hymn goes on. It's the story in which each of us is making up a story. and we search for each other. We hold the candles out, but only light our own faces. We're somewhere in a story the hymn repeats. It's the last verse no one ever seems to know. It's the one we mouth the words to, watching other mouths mouth words in the dark church of memory. So I grew up Catholic, and we did sing hymns in the Catholic Church. There wasn't a lot of singing in my church in particular, but what I remembered as I was writing this poem hymn is that the peculiar quality of hymn singing is that often people will remember the first verse and then have some sense of the second verse, and then the third verse will come along and only a few people will know that, and then the fourth verse of the hymn will come along and nobody knows that. And I do think that memory works that way too, that there's a story that we all share and agree upon, and then there's a story underneath that that some of us might recognize and know, and there's another one underneath that which is a real secret, which is a real mystery that others still might know. And then there's a story underneath even those mystical and secret stories that nobody knows. And that's what we might call reality. And I guess as a poet, I can't begin to expect to reach that fourth level of the hymn, but in my poems, I do know that what David Baker said is true, is that a poem is more than one story. Even a short poem, even a haiku, is many stories being told at the same time. So this poem comes from my fifth book called Another City, which is featured in The Long Answer. It's my selected and new poems. And I'm just so thankful to Henry Crawford and the folks at Cafe Muse, Renee Garrity, and others who came together to make this reading possible for me. I was going to give a reading of Politics and Prose on Saturday, and of course that got canceled. And then these guys came along and asked me if I'd like to be a part of this program, which is a big honor and a privilege. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Henry and Renee and Leah and all the others who made this possible. I'm in your debt. This is called Blessing for the Liver. It comes from my first book. It's the first poem of my first book, which was published in 1999. Blessing for the liver. The heart with its lies is perched in blue branches, neither dangerous nor kind, the serpent, the lonely. And the brain is where the world once fell from the smallest tree in the orchard, the apple my great-grandfather carves with a razor for eternity, twirling it in his hands to eat, the delectable fruit we are too much of. But cut the liver from my body intact, which faced all my poisons. No wonder it's the bearer of the soul, stone at the end of my life. The North. The saddest trains go north. Along the aisles, men hang in place. They grasp the drooping wires and try not to remember their loneliness. The women sit. They wave. They move their hands like through water. They clutch their purses and square hats. They're so busy, they have no time to ward off strangers. When they come to a stop, all bow forward like in a prayer. The men unclench. The women gather their things. The hands of children, still asleep, are heaviest. I read this poem once to a classroom of fifth graders, and I have to say fifth graders are poetic geniuses because they are able to float through a poem without feeling the obligation or responsibility to understand every line of it. They can float through the poem to the end and then walk away with impressions. What really surprised me when I was reading to these fifth graders last year is that they remembered so much of it anyway. And I have a picture of that day on my from my website, which I wanted to share with you. This is me reading that poem, The North, to these fifth graders, and you can see that I was writing on the board. If you can see the picture, I was writing on the board the lines that they were remembering, and by the end of our discussion, they had remembered every line of the poem, every image of the poem. I don't think there's a greater compliment for a poet. But you can also see that their hands are lifted up into the air as if they're flying off their bodies, which is kind of funny because the last line of the poem, the women gather their things, the hands of children still asleep are heaviest. So an act of children waking up, with their hands flying off their body, much better than the poem that I read to them. So when I was about 26 years old, after I had gotten my MFA from Penn State University, jobless, directionless, I knew I wanted to be a poet and not much more. I decided that I would leave the United States and go abroad to the Czech Republic and teach there for at least a year under the auspices of a Soros Foundation fellowship. And I was able to gain the fellowship. I went to a small town called Frýdek Místek on the eastern edge of the Czech Republic, right on the Polish and Slovakian border. And I have to say that when I arrived there, I began to really write my first poems. Most of the poems from my first book came from the 2 years that I spent teaching there. I was teaching high school students who didn't speak English at all, and I didn't speak Czech, so it was mostly exercises and pantomime. But I had a wonderful time. I made many friends. Unfortunately, because of the time, those friends couldn't make it to the reading tonight, but I will send them a recording of this. And I owe that place so much. I owe them my inner life. I owe them my having learned again how to fall in love with language, how to forget that people were watching. As a writer, we're always thinking about who's watching. But when I went abroad and found myself completely isolated in this town by language, I was able to forget myself, and I was able to write my first best poems, and the poems that I would go on to write for the rest of my career up to now. So this poem is called Waking on the Przybor Train. It comes from my second book. And Przybor is the name of a town where Freud was born. It's just south of Frýdek Místek, where I lived. And it was known to be a Jewish city, although the Jewish community had long since been deported or exited that town. And the eerie thing about Przybor is that in the antique shops, in the small shops, you could see the remnants of that community. Their things were there on sale in the antique shop. So this poem is really about that absence, which is so strong, it feels like a presence in these remains. Waking on the Przybor train near Freud's birthplace. I hear before I see. Halfway through the rain-wet fields of Przybor in winter, some distant barking dogs suggest the town. I've heard tell of its shops with names predating the war when this was a Jewish city. I've found it all this way, like a cup or a pocket knife or a hat from childhood I thought was lost. Illumined by the station lights, the tiny veins flicker behind my eyes and I open my eyes. It's like floating back into the world after prayer. The moon is out, the dogs are slick and fluid in their tight black fur. It's another poem from that period. This comes from my first book. It's called The Dove. And it's about that falling in love with language again and the slowness of speech, the deliciousness of words. The dove. Days the crowds emerge at 3 p.m. In September, performers emerge with their stands. The doves unfold like paper in a street magician's hands. And the new money is good for bread, and the old money for salt, yeast, sugar. The old money in one pocket, the new in the other. On the table, we keep a dictionary. It takes minutes for Nika to say, "You are tender," and me back, "You are tender." The bath, the white tub, Turkish coffee on a white chair. For a long while, I've been too fast to talk. I should take my time with words. The words are precious. An hour for the coffee on the fire. A dove. The image of the magician opening his coat and the doves flying out. It's something I think about all the time with language, the way we can just open our mouths and take for granted the words will fly out, little miracles flying out of our mouths. But there are some words that in my translation classes at American University where I teach, we have long discussions about untranslatable words. And that word dove to me is the untranslatable word in this poem because it really is shaped like the thing that it's describing in a way that no other word for dove could possibly be. It's this one little monosyllable and it's got a blunt end at the front and it's got a dovetail in the back with that V sound. Just the feeling of the word dove in your mouth. And to experience that again, it was worth the whole trip for me. So the town, just to give you all a visual, I've never done this. I've never been able to do it with a reading, but why not? So this is Friedeck Mistek, the town that I wrote so much about in my first books. And this is a recent picture of Friedeck Mistek, but it's exactly the square that I discovered when I went there at 26 years old. And I used to write my poems in a little Cukrarna, the candy store that's behind the castle where those umbrellas are. That's where I wrote the Blessing for the Liver, and that's where I wrote the Dove poem. And to see this on the Wikipedia page for Friedeck Mistek is near and dear to my heart. So a couple more of the older poems to try to set up that story, the hymn story. And then I'll read some new poems from the collection, The Long Answer. Here are two poems that I wrote at wildly different times in my life, 15 years apart, but they're partner poems. This is called Side Work. Great things begin in the periphery. Meanwhile, my father works third shift at the mustard plant. He's around my age. He's finished for the night. He revs his truck, waiting for the heat. The ladder shakes in its rack on top. The heat is dusty coming on. All this can happen without us, just out of view. It's almost morning. The smallest tools begin to shudder now in their boxes. So that's about my father. It's really about my father. And the guilt he expressed to me about his absences when I was younger. I don't know if I noticed them consciously, but he did have two jobs, and his side work jobs, he called them, sometimes more than two jobs, but he would be gone for most of the day, and he would come home when I was going to bed, and he would be leaving for work when I was getting up during the week. And I guess there was this fascination that grew out of that. What's happening now? Where is he now? And so that sense of great things beginning in the periphery, in the margins, and a lifelong fascination with those margins might have begun with him. But this is a partner poem to it, and it's also a response to Robert Hayden's great poem, those winter Sundays, which I know some of my students, my undergraduate students, are watching tonight. And we've been talking about that poem this week, where at the end of the poem, Robert Hayden is saying, think about all the things that my father did for me while I was sleeping, and how he would shine his shoes and light a fire so that the house was warm before he got up. And what did I know? What did I know of love's lonely and austere offices? So this is my response to that and the partner poem to Side Work, and it appeared again in Another City in 2018, My Father's Hours. I went searching for a clue of some collaboration between the two who ruled that house, with its discouragements, for a glance or the morse of clicking silverware, as on the late shift nights, over the chair he hung his heavy green coat, and then his hard hat by its strap of white plastic. And like a man in an elevator falling, he would stand frozen, the work still loud in his body. What was the story he told himself? Coming home on these evenings was his life. When I met him at the door, in my pajamas of men on motorcycles, all of them helmeted, impassive, doing wheelies in the air. Now up the wooden hill, he said, and he pointed his finger at nothing. Somewhere in my mid-30s, I started to seriously translate a poet in Denmark named Carsten René Nielsen, who was a prose poet, solely prose poet, and he would write these short little fabulous prose poems in Danish, and together he and I would untangle them into English. And we had some success with those poems. And if you've ever translated work, you know that it's impossible to translate a poem and not have it get into your DNA, which is what happened to me, I think in a big way, because the next two books I wrote were all prose poems. And I still write prose poems. You'll see in the later pieces that I'll read today. But these come from two books, one called The Prayers of Others, and the other one that came a few years later called The Most Natural Thing. And I'm just going to read them straight through. They're little dreams, little imaginative leaps. You have to float like a fifth grader for these. We stripped and swam to the green island. It was earliest summer. There is such a thing as midnight sun. Osa, let me touch her from behind, her body so much older than mine. Underwater, she yelled something. What? I don't remember. What we call sorrow is merely failing memory. The assumption. From its pellet-like source, the universe widens. Our car broke down near the fairgrounds that winter. There I once saw the world's tallest man, harrowed by his ankyloses. He sat in a chair, waving at us. Then he rose as if climbing a rope. 5 o'clock, just about dark. The tow truck arrived. It cranked down its hook on a chain. It hoisted the bumper, lip of a fish, almost vertical. All together we climbed in the truck, the father, the son, the quiet driver. Max Jacob's prayer list at Drancy. Jacob was a Jewish French poet who converted to Catholicism, was deported in 1944 from his home in Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire to Paris, to Drancy, which was a camp that like a transit camp where people were kept for a short period before being sent off to Auschwitz and other camps in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. So Jacob was and still is one of my heroes as a poet. This is about his prayer list, his very strange prayer list, which you can find online. I've forgotten no one in my continuous prayers, the French prose poet Max Jacob wrote the abbot upon his reassignment at Drancy. The Gestapo had not heard of his conversion, would not have understood his strange poems anyway. There exist 2 sheets of paper covered with names, from Picasso to Jean Cocteau and others, artists who would not have wanted or asked for his prayers. Of course, grace is not dependent on belief. It visits independent of our wishes or our need. The author of the prayer was in the gravest danger, but I've yet to find his name on these lists. The writing at the end grows tiny. Some names are just a squiggle, a mustache. And then finally, removal. To feel each branching outward part. I don't feel each part, though I've prayed to hear the small breath of my cells at Wet Mountain. The aspen grove sends messages in leaf code to its heart, a clutch of roots. Mildew zones out in the provinces. Burn up, the yellow aspen says, which is another way of saying, remember who you are. As you move in your beautiful, arched upward body, believing yourself to be your own kingdom, believing yourself to be only yourself instead of the land. That poem is dedicated to Adam Tamashasky and his family. Adam came into my office after that poem was published and recited it back to me, which never happens. So that's for him. And then 2 more of these prose poems. These come from Another City, which is a book that I dedicated to my dear friend Kermit Moyer, who I believe is watching tonight. Love Sickness. The octopus loved her naturalist so deeply. Soon the giant ink-filled head remained permanently flat on her shoulders, looking upward from the aquarium as the other gazed down into it. Then an egg the size of a grain of rice fell from the octopus. Distance is sometimes confused for love. I've begun to feel so far from myself. I want to have a child. And the leatherback. It's dying, this heaviest of turtles. So magnetized to earth, great is its labor to be itself being, to move with sliding steps the brown flippers. Now it rests in the no man's land of dry sand, having lost its way, like my father did, on his path back to bed when he fell and I couldn't lift him. The dying are always the heaviest until they reach the wave. And then one last poem from this collection, Another City. Every angel is terrifying. There was the time one of the younger deer stepped into the hedges at the house that we called Homewood. And through an open window, he lowered the shale-colored muscular shoulders. His eyes met my eyes and pushed partway through. I thought it was to see who was alive in here, or to offer some encouragement. with his aware, impassive face. May I stay heavy on this mind, I found myself requesting. May part of me remain behind these eyes, but it did not. The herd continued down their unmown road, and the deer at the window broke his gaze and turned and followed them. This was the start of some new work for me. It was fall. I'd been trying to untangle all my questions. I wished that I was not myself. I never saw the angel after that. Time passed, nor did the herd return. I went back to what I had been doing all along, except that I could feel a certain focus, the concentration of a being standing watching what I am. So my my new book is a collection of all of these selected poems from the past, which I tried to arrange in a way that told a story of its own. And there are some revisions among those poems too. I figure if Bob Dylan paved the way, then I could do it too. So I did revise some of the earlier poems. But this new book, The Long Answer, also has about 30 pages of new poems in the back. And this book is dedicated to my dear friends, Amy Gussack and Bobby Whalen, who've done so much for me in the 13 years that we've been friends. So these first poems are prose poems. This piece is called Composition for Three Voices, a Tenement in Moravia. And I have a friend who told me that these poems are about what we do to survive and how we move on with the trauma literally inside our bodies sometimes. And I was so glad for that reading, because I didn't know I was writing that, but I think she's right. Composition for Three Voices. First flat, Irena's voice. So these are my neighbors in my tenement building in Friedeck Mistek who are speaking. Irena's voice. We have a word that's very difficult. Its parts skip backward on the tongue. A word as much to swallow as to say. And when you say it, you will be one of us. Ch, t, ver, tek. English, Thursday. Čtvrtek. But you must carve it like tough meat into parts. Why am I alive? During war, this is difficult to say. Men from another city, it was Havijov, called on my mother every Thursday. Cakes, milk, bread, sometimes a bit of meat or butter. They paid her for their privileges. Čtvrtek was the hardest word, hardest day. I'm alive because I ate the whole meal every Thursday. Second flat, Ferda's voice. Over the town, the stacks blew a cape made of ashes. Magic shows rely on simple faith. A man cannot be cut in two. Sit up and try to walk away. A woman can't just disappear. A tongue cannot be shredded cloth, pulled out of the mouth. So beliefs instruct. The ride into Poland had many stops. They stopped in this town. They stopped over there, and others waved from the platform. They asked for some to step forward. They took our hands sometimes and helped us on the train. They asked us little questions on our hopes and destinations. We believed in the trick and stepped into their boxes with the slots where the knives go in. Third flat, Pavel's voice. The dead of winter was the part I played. It was a small role, and I never spoke. Sometime in March in 1945, my boots were stolen. With feet as cold as iron, I stood sweeping snow from the tent in the last hours of the world. Where am I? Where am I going? I thought, the snows of wartime passing over my head. If I keep moving, I'll live, so I will not bequeath my iron feet to anyone. Therefore, I have no children, no wife, no flesh to pour this heaviness into. I'm still that shoeless man, standing upright with his broom brimmed with ire. But I'm also myself, a softer person. The shoeless man and I are floating on a stage. We lower the broom on each side and row through snow until now. So I think I'll do two more poems and then we'll have some time for some questions afterwards that I think Henry told me are written somewhere inside my computer. Let's see what happens. But this is called Composition for the Faith of Clifford Brown. So I love jazz. I've been listening to jazz since I was 16, and Clifford Brown is a genius of the 1950s. He's like Keats of the 1950s. He died at 25, just as his teeming brain was experiencing the heights of his powers, and I'm sure he would have gone further and further. He's also a kind of young Goodman Brown. It was known that in the 50s, when everybody else was using heroin and other kinds of stimulants to manage to play the way they played, Charlie Parker, for example, Clifford Brown was as straight as an arrow, and he walked straight onto stage night after night. So when he was 25, he was on the road. He was asleep in the car, and he was on the road to Chicago from Philadelphia, where he had just performed. And the car ran off the road in a storm, and he died. So I imagine him falling asleep, thinking nothing of it, and that strange moment of him losing consciousness with the rain coming down. And I guess in the epigraph, I'm comparing it to young Goodman Brown in the middle of the night, being flown to the Black Mass in the middle of the woods and seeing all of his neighbors there, and then waking up the next morning and wondering, was all that a dream? The epigraph goes, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and merely dreamed a wild dream? This is from Hawthorne's story, Young Goodman Brown. Composition for the Faith of Clifford Brown. On June 25th, 1956, it's a hard bop. Max Roach on drums that brings you up to Philadelphia. It's reported to Music City. I've heard tell. To serenade a wall of cigarette smoke, stone sober, with tinkling glass and ashtrays falling down slow motion. Your second to last night alive. There's much to get wrong about this story, like any story often riffed. How it was not on the following night your wife, but Richie Powell's, who did the driving in the rain I once believed was pouring on the empty PA Turnpike, was falling instead on a town called New Bedford, near Pittsburgh, as your party passed through dead tired. I can't know if you fell in slow motion, asleep in a passenger seat because you wanted to relax your hands. I can't know if you wanted to lay your head against your Buick's thick window and sleep to the sound of syncopated raindrops spattering in flutes across the glass, or even if you intended with the faith of 25-year-olds to wake up fresh, still famous, only halfway through a hard storm. Still Clifford, still full of wild gifts, at rest and in the city of Chicago. This poem is sonnet, and the epigraph is simply, "You are that which is not," from Catherine of Siena. The stork has gone. Here is the nest. It teeters on the station tower like a satellite dish encircled in grass or tiny bits of hair over and over, or yarn around a pair of unseen hands. Old transmissions have come to a hush. The air is static whirl. The road winds. I wonder at this gat, this bulrush basket, mouth and waiting for its tooth. The stork was here. Here is the nest. Praise the giving way, the taking wing. Praise the singing bowl after the song. Praise who cast from such delicate bronze an absence. And then this is the last poem in the book. It's the title poem of the collection, The Long Answer. It's now so late, the two men seated in the middle of the frozen escalator on Connecticut Avenue, underground, can take their time to weld the one thing to another thing, anonymous and slow. Their heads almost touch. The sun's surface flash of the rod is not to be gazed into. In their masks, they resemble the gods at Easter Island. As under the stairs, I see a small hatch has been opened where the guts of the moving treadmill are exposed. They say nothing to each other. They stare down at the work of making things work. They will not even show their surprise when the slats, one folding out of the next, begin to rise as steps that they will open to us, that we will ride into the dome of summer. Like the answer to a question so old, no one can say what was asked in the first place, and which leaves us on the tip of night's tongue, sleepy and arriving in waves of heat, with only each other. On Connecticut Avenue, come out from underground. Thank you all for listening. And I suppose we do have time for some questions. I'm going to put my earphone back in.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Let me see if I can, there we go. All right, so let's take a couple of questions. David, that was an outstanding reading. And it was just very special, particularly in this time of the coronavirus. You know, we're all sitting at home and we get just so little poetry, and you gave us a lot. So
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, let me take a look at these questions. And they have a little voting thing, but it looks like everybody was pretty neutral. So we'll just run through them in series. The first one says, can you tell us how you chose the poems for this collection, what you wanted to capture? And that was by Stephanie Grant.
I'm getting an echo in my ear, so every time I answer, I'm going to take my earphones out. How did I choose the poem? What was the question again? How did I choose?
Let's see, where did it go? How did you choose the poems for this collection and what you wanted to capture?
Well, first, Stephanie, thank you for being here. Stephanie is our fearless leader of the MFA program at American University, and we are all so much in your debt. You're just a wonderful friend of the program and to each of us, and a great colleague and a fantastic writer. Check out Stephanie Grant's novels, Map of Ireland, and Passion of Alice. How did I choose the poems? Well, I wanted the book to be a story of its own. and I wanted these poems to speak to each other, even though who we meet on those pages are me at 25 and me at 50. You know, half of my life is represented there, and all of my writing life. But I suppose I did lean towards the poems that I still like, but I think thematically there were a few things that kept popping up, and one was fascination with the body as thing. You know, Heidegger talks about things. And Henry, you know a lot about this, and I know only a little. But Heidegger talks about things in the way that objects, once they become obsolete from their older uses, then graduate into things, and then they become metaphorical for everything else. And so I'm thinking about the body in that way too. I think about the organs of the body, like the liver. And at the end of the blessing for the liver, the line is something like "stone at the end of my life," and there's this allusion to the Egyptian processes of taking the liver out of the body last and preserving it because it was seen to be the house of the soul. So I guess those body poems, specifically poems that were about my relationship with my father, which I think are consistent from the beginning of my writing until now, and poems about the way that we house and live with and eat and move through trauma. But I also wanted to lean in a little bit more towards the poems of praise, because not that there aren't that many in my writing, but I think that it's something that I wanted to pronounce a little bit more, especially now. I'm glad I did, given that the book came out on April 7th in the midst of all of this. And that last poem, The Long Answer, is really about us waking up from millennia of a dream, a millennia long dream, I guess I could say, of fantasy, into a world in which we have only each other. And you know, it ends on a high note, I would say, because that's something. And even though we're all here in isolation, when I read that poem, I get choked up because I do feel like there's a togetherness I'm experiencing right now that's unlike anything I've ever experienced in my life. I don't know what that is exactly, but I'm hoping that the poems that I go on to write after this are going to tap into that quite a bit more too.
Okay, so thank you, David. All right, so we now have a top rated question, and it is from Linda Voris, who asks, so much about prayer in these poems, David. Do you want to say something about the relation between prayer and lyrical poetry?
Well, these poems are coming from leaders in their field. Linda Voris, thank you for coming to the reading, first of all. And Linda, you taught me that composition is meaning. And so, yeah, I think that by tapping into the form of prayer, as I know it, and it's going to be different for me than it is for anybody else, but by tapping into even the visual aspects of what a prayer looks like on the page, like in that hymn poem. One of the reasons I wanted to show the poems to you all, because I think that the visual component is meaningful as much as the oral component is and the rhetorical component is. Henry and I were talking about this before the reading started. So I feel like by making the poem look like a prayer with a lot of white space, there's a lightness to it that keeps it somewhere between the earth and the sky. But there's also an element to the prayer that is about distance and about reaching and about never quite capturing what it is you're reaching for. Neruda talks about this when he says that, yeah, if you think that words can describe anything, try to describe silence. The moment that you say the word silence, you're corrupting the thing that you're trying to describe. So I think implicitly, when you're using words to describe the transcendent, you're setting yourself up for a failure. But there's a power to that, and there's an energy to that, and I think that that's the realm of prayer, that between place where the language is actually trying to unlanguage itself to a certain extent where it can wrap itself around the invisible and momentarily grab that transcendent feeling of connection to everything else, of something bigger than yourself, whatever you want to call it. Mary Oliver called it the spiritual purpose of the poem. So thank you for that question. That's actually an important aspect of the writing process for me, thinking about the way, and you taught me that, thinking about the ways that composition and meaning are inextricably tied together.
Okay, David, here's another two voted question. This is from Laura Dinardis, who asks, amazing, David, if the poems in this beautiful collection were music, what would it be?
Well, once again, Laura, thank you for being here. Laura's new book, The Internet and Everything, brilliant book on internet governance and the Internet of Things. My incredibly devoted friends and famous colleagues are asking me questions here. If this were music, what would it be? I guess it ties into Linda's question about prayer. If it were music, the poem would be somewhere between a Leonard Cohen song and John Coltrane's early work. I would love to be able to write a poem that doesn't rely on chronology and moves more towards simultaneity like jazz does. But at the same time, I love a poem that has wisdom, that leads me to a certain place and then delivers a punch at the end. And that's what Leonard Cohen does so gorgeously in his songs, whether they're ballads or whether they're lyrics. So somewhere between those two worlds, that's what I would hope for in my own poetry.
That's a pretty challenging question. Let's see what else. We'll take a couple more. This is one from Monica Sock. I hope I got her. S-O-K, Sock. I guess that's how you pronounce it. What reflections do you have about writing about a place in which you're a visitor?
This is the evening of 2020 books, because Monica Sook's book, I mean, if you can go to Amazon.com right now and buy Monica Sook's, or some other independent bookstore, I should say, and buy Monica Sook's book, A Nail the Evening Hangs On, please buy it. She's a brilliant poet, but I need the question again. Sorry. I'm plugging my friend's books here to listen to the questions.
All right, where did that one? All right, what reflections do you have about writing about a place in which you're a visitor?
That's a good question. There is a point where, what does Italo Calvino say? That traveling is a negative mirror. The traveler sees what he is not when he visits a place. And there's the sense of seeing what you are not, but there's also a sense of seeing what you are. In one of the early poems of my writing life, for my first book, I write about coming across my family name and like a tenement buzzer on Vicolo San Lorenzo down in Sciacca, Sicily. And there's something so familiar about seeing your family name. It was actually my great-grandfather's name. It wasn't his apartment, but it was my great-grandfather's name on this buzzer. But I've never felt more distant from a place and more separate than in that moment, because what I felt very heavily is that I was carrying my America around with me everywhere I went. So one of the benefits of traveling and being a writer who travels is that you become more acutely aware of the things you bring to your ways of seeing when you're looking at how other people see them and take for granted their ways of seeing. So it's an incredible advantage, because you turn back to yourself and you begin to question, I think healthfully, your own biases and assumptions. And it helps you as a writer. On the other side of it, there's something about being the traveler that makes the contact with other people more precious, because it's not to be taken for granted. And as someone who grew up in a country where I was taught English as my native language, I have a privilege that others don't have. I could travel to most countries of the world and just open my mouth and start speaking, and somebody in the crowd would probably understand me. So to try to remove myself from that and to experience the delight and the struggle to make myself understood in the Czech Republic in 1995, when hardly anybody spoke English in my town. A lot of people spoke Russian, but only the younger students of mine, the seniors, and some of the teachers spoke English, and nobody else. So there was this struggle to be understood that made me appreciate the words and made me appreciate the miracle of language and the contact that I could make with people in that situation. So that's what it still brings me today, and I try as best I can to put myself in positions where I can either try to learn the language and speak it a little bit, to play my part wherever I go.
Very good, David. I think we got time for one more. We don't want to keep you here too long, but here is one from Kathy Schaaf. I think her name is pronounced, and she wants to know, when you modify an earlier poem, are you refining the existing expression or expanding, changing the message?
Well, hi, Kathy. Thank you for that question. A beloved colleague at American University, Kathy Schaaf. When I'm revising a poem, I can't help but see it through the lens of who I am now. That's what makes it interesting. Some of the poems didn't need to be revised. I felt like they were still fairly clear windows of something in me that is the same. But then every once in a while, there's a poem that either formally still felt off kilter to me, and I wanted to try it in a new form, the way someone might play an old song in a new way. Bruce Springsteen got a lot of flack because he began to play, I think it was Born to Run. It's a kind of slow ballad when he was in his 40s. It felt right to him to do that. But people criticized him because they like it the old way. There's a moment where you feel like you can't help it. It's got to change as you change. So revision at its best is something like seeing the poem again in a new way, or working like a translator and trying to deliver now in this new context the same effect that the original had when I was 25 or 26. And so it's a combination of those things.
Okay, David. All right. Well, thanks again for just a remarkable reading. And so please join us on May 4, 2020, when Cafe Muse will feature the poets Lisa Lewis and Brad Richard. And also come back for our next Poets versus the Pandemic on Wednesday, May 13, 2020, where we'll be featuring Nadia Colburn and her book, The High Shelf. Let me thank David Keplinger once again for his tremendous reading and for making such a great evening for all of us shut-ins here. And let me thank the WordWorks and Cafe Muse for their sponsorship of the series. And thank you all for coming out, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks, everybody.
All right.